Hello again, friends. Ola Wikander here again, your friendly neighborhood Ugaritologist with more stuff that may seem banal, but which really isn't. It's really quite awesome stuff that you can learn from biblical studies and comparative linguistics and stuff like that. And today I'm going to read you a little bit of Hurrian. Why do you think I'm going to read you a bit of Hurrian? Well, Hurrian was an important language in the Bronze Age ancient Near East. It was spoken in many parts of the Levant. We find Hurrian text, for example, in Ugarit, in what is today Syria, the coast of Syria. Ugarit is my own specialty due to the fact that I'm a Ugaritologist, and many of the texts we find at Ugarit are either in Ugaritic, which is my specialty, a relative of Hebrew, or in Akkadian, which was the language of commerce and diplomacy back in the Bronze Age ancient Near East. But there are other languages from Ugarit as well, and one of the languages you find stuff written in is Hurrian. You also find Hurrian as the main language of the so-called Mitanni kingdom, which was a kingdom in what is today northern Iraq and Syria. Mitanni was something of a multicultural kingdom because we know that parts of the ruling class there, not least some of their kings, bore names which are actually not Hurrian but Indic, an Indic language that is an Indo-Iranian language, one of the branches of Indo-Iranian, a language that seems to have been quite close to Vedic Sanskrit. That doesn't mean that people moved there from India. You sometimes hear people misunderstand this. No, what that means is that some speakers of Indic Indo-European apparently, well, turned south on their way from the Indo-European homeland in the Pontic-Caspian steppes and ended up in the ancient Near East rather than in India, where most of them did. So we do have features from Indic languages represented in Mitanni. Among apparently the ruling classes, especially their names, are often Indic. But the main language of Mitanni was Hurrian. Hurrian can be found actually in the Hebrew Bible as well. One of the most famous examples of this is the name of the guy from which King David is said to have bought the threshing floor. The owner of this threshing floor is said in the Hebrew Bible, his name is said to have been Araunah, which doesn't look like a Hebrew name at all. It's probably Hurrian. And actually, it's probably not even a name, because Araunah is probably a metathesis, that is, with letters thrown around from what in Hurrian would be ewir-ne. And ewir-ne means the Lord or the King. The tradition seems to say that David bought this place from a guy in Jerusalem whose name was the King, or the Lord. The point, of course, being that this wasn't a name, it was a title that the Hebrew tradition, the Israelite tradition, then misunderstood as a name when they couldn't pass the original Hurrian. There are other Hurrian names here and there in the Hebrew Bible, like there's a guy called Shamgar, Shamgar ben Anath, whose name Shamgar is probably borrowed from the Hurrian Shimige Ari, given by the sun god. So he's basically called Heliodotos, if you translate it into what it would be in Greek, sun given, Shimige Ari, because Shimige is the name of the sun god. Ari is a form of the Hurrian word for give. Hurrian was a language that was not Semitic, so it wasn't related to Ugaritic or Hebrew or Akkadian. Neither was it Indo-European, so it wasn't related to Hittite or Luwian or English for that matter, or Swedish. It belonged to a small linguistic family known as Hurro-Urartian, which, as the name implies, is just made up of two languages, Hurrian, which is what we're talking about here, and Urartian, which was spoken in the kingdom of Urartu near Lake Van. And those two languages, which are quite clearly related to one another, they make up the whole of this linguistic family as far as we know. There may have been other relatives, of course, but we don't know. And there have been suggestions that the Hurro-Urartian languages would be related to other languages we know today from the Caucasus, for example, Northeast Caucasian, for example. But it's quite unclear if those connections are actually true. So the consensus is that Hurrian and Urartian make up a small linguistic family unto themselves. And what do we have written in Hurrian? Well, a little of this and a little of that. The first thing to note is that there are two attested dialects or registers of Hurrian. One of them is called Mitanni Hurrian, which is what we find in the so-called Mitanni Letter, which we'll be discussing later on. That's actually what I'll be reading a bit of. And that seems to have been the form of Hurrian that was used in, say, the administration of the Mitanni Empire. And then there was something that in scholarship is mostly referred to as Old Hurrian, which is a somewhat different dialect or register of Hurrian with verbal forms, for example, that differ from what you find in the Mitanni dialect. And in Old Hurrian, we have a number of literary texts. For example, a wonderful text called the Epic of Liberation. Liberation in Hurrian is Kirentsi. And this text is very cool because it's a parallel text. It's preserved from the Hittite capital Hattusa in Asia Minor, and it's actually bilingual. It's a bilingual text in cuneiform with the Hurrian original and the Hittite translation, which has been enormously helpful in understanding this wonderful text, which includes basically two types of things. It includes mythology about the storm god and trying to get certain captives free from the city of Ebla, and that's why it's called the Epic of Liberation, but it also has lots of wonderful animal fables in it. Maybe we'll talk about those later on this channel. So that's in Old Hurrian and with a Hittite translation, and there are a couple of other texts in Old Hurrian as well. But the most important text for the decipherment of Hurrian was the Mitanni Letter, which is one of the so-called Amarna letters from Amarna in Egypt, where the heretic pharaoh Akhenaton moved the capital out into the desert to a place called Amarna. It was called Akhenaton back then. His moving the palace archives there meant that we have access to them today because his heretical new capital was abandoned after his death. So we have lots of stuff from both Akhenaton and his father, Amenhotep III. And the Mitanni Letter is one of these. It's a letter from King Tušratta of Mitanni to Amenhotep III about the marriage of the pharaoh to one of the daughters of Tušratta, a daughter called Tadocheba. And they discuss the dowry and lots of politicking around this dynastic marriage. And the letter is written in Hurrian, which is rare because mostly this type of international correspondence would have been carried out and was carried out in Akkadian, the language of Mesopotamia, because that was the most common international auxiliary language for diplomacy in the ancient Near East. But this long letter between Tušratta and Amenhotep III was actually written in Hurrian. And we have it preserved in Hurrian in cuneiform from Amarna. By the way, the name of the king Tušratta is an example of the Indic names of many Mitannian rulers. The name Tušratta is not Hurrian, it's Indic. And Indic, again, not in a geographical but a linguistic sense, because Tušratta, or Tušratta, as he's sometimes spelt, is apparently identical with what in Vedic or Sanskrit would be Tvesharata, the one with the vehement battle chariot, which is a very Indo-European sounding name, given the importance of chariot warfare in some branches of Indo-European. So Tušratta or Tvesharata, or in Vedic terms, Tvesharata, the one with a vehement battle chariot. But he wrote his letter not in any Indic dialect, because that may by that time have been extinct, only used for names and such, and specialized terminology. But he wrote his letter in Hurrian, and I'm going to read from this letter so you can hear what Hurrian sounds like. And it starts like this. Inutannin cheni senifus tadia, inumenin cheni senifeisas tadav, anami dilan, tesobas, savuskas, amanu dilan, simigene dilan, easharine dilan, manso dilan, enasus, Tissiasanna tissan tadastiden. Okay. You actually heard the word Shimige there, the name of the sun god. So it starts Inu tanin cheni senifus tadia. Inu tanin. Just as now me. Well, just as me, and then we have cheni, which means now, just as now me, and then we have senifus. Sen or sena means brother. Ifu is the suffix meaning mine, and the s at the end is the ergative ending. Hurrian was an ergative language, which means a language that marks the subject of a transitive clause, that is a clause with an object, with a direct object, and an intransitive clause, that is a clause without a direct object in different ways. And the way you mark the subject of a transitive clause in such a language is using the case known as ergative, and this is the case marked with a s sound in Hurrian. So we get senifus, brother mine ergative. And then we have the verb tadia, he loves. So just as my brother loves me, so much as my brother loves me. Brother, by the way, was the normal term using which ancient Near Eastern great kings wrote to their colleagues. So if one great king addresses somebody as brother, it means that they regard each other as being on the same level, both of them being great kings. So this is a way in which Tušratta shows that he regards Amenhotep III as a great king, someone on the same level as him, because they are brothers. So inutanin cheni senifus tadia. Now, just as my brother loves me, as you love me, and then the next line, inumenin cheni seni isas tadav, just as I love my brother. Isas is the ergative of I, so I, for my part, love my brother. Anami dilan tesubas savusgas amanu dilan simigene dilan easharine dilan mansus dilan enasus tisiasanna tisan tadastiden. Just as they love each other, I, that is Tušratta, and his brother, that is Amenhotep, in that same way, all the named gods, Tesubas, Tesub is the name of the Hurrian storm god, the Hurrian equivalent, say, of Baal. So Baal and Savuska, Savuska was the Hurrian goddess par excellence, not the only goddess, but one of the most important goddesses, who also was very important subsequently as a patron goddess for Hittite rulers. So Tesub and Savuska and Amanu, which is Amanu here, that's Amun, the Egyptian gods. So they enumerate not only Hurrian gods like Tesub and Savska, but also Amun, that is a god of the addressee, that is a god of Amenhotep, and Shimige, who is the sun god, the Hurrian sun god, and Ea-Shari, King Ea, Ea being the Mesopotamian trickster and wisdom god. And all of those, what are they to do? All the gods, all the Enasus. Ene is Hurrian for God, and then there's the plural ending, which is as, and then the us at the end, which is again the ergative ending. So all of these gods are to do something towards someone else because it's in the ergative. And what are they supposed to do? Well, tadast iden, they are to love. May they love. And they are to love us. And how are they to love us? Tisiasana, in their hearts. And they are to love us with another word that's repeated and sounds a bit like tisiasana, but it's not the same word. It's tisan, much. So just as my brother loves me and I love my brother, so may also Tesub, Savuska, Amun, Simige, Ea the king, all of these gods, may they love us very much in their hearts. Enasus tisiasanna tisan tadastiden. That's Hurrian for you, isn't it nice? I'm going to read it again. Inutanin cheni senifus tadia, inumenin cheni senife isas tadav, anamidilan tesubas savuskas, amanudilan simigene dilan, easharine dilan, manso dilan, enasus tisiasanna tisan tadastiden. That's Hurrian. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it beautiful? A third time. Inutanin cheni senifus tadia, inumenin cheni senife isas tadav, anami dilan tesubas savuskas, amanu dilan, shimigene dilan, easharine dilan, manso dilan, enasus tisiasana tisan tadastiden. Right, so that's the Mitanni Letter, and it's much longer than that. Those are just pleasantries. But it gives you a sort of look into the way in which late Bronze Age great kings wrote diplomacy to one another, and that could be quite interesting. So Hurrian was an important language in the ancient Near East, and like I said, we see traces of this even in the Hebrew Bible. So yeah, Hurrian texts, like so many others, read best in their original languages. Thank you.